Hey guys, what's up? I want to talk about the invasion mechanic, and I've talked about the invasion mechanic. I've talked about it from a few different perspectives. I've talked about it most recently about why people disconnect in Souls games, and this video will touch on some of those same themes, but it's going to have a much different focus. Obviously, Elden Ring is coming in another 6 months or so. It's been confirmed it's going to have invasions just like every other From multiplayer game has had invasions. So it's a good bet that a lot of the complaints that we've heard over the years about invasions in Dark Souls 3 and other Souls games we'll hear again in Elden Ring. And I thought it would be valuable to take a stand and put a video out, and this video is really intended to do a couple things. It's intended to explain why invasions exist in the first place and why they're actually a good mechanic for the host, not just for the invader, but it's a great mechanic for the host and for the phantoms, and also to try to deal with the most common arguments that I hear against invasions. And what's really striking, and we'll get into this, is really how bad the arguments are. They really don't stand up to any amount of scrutiny, and we're going to talk about why that is. Actually, I think there's a really interesting reason why those arguments are as poor as they are, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So I'd like to start with a simple request, which is if you've come to this video, if you don't like invasions, if they frustrate you or make you angry in some way, I ask that you just listen with an open mind, with an open heart, and a willingness to reconsider your view of the world, and just be willing to accept that maybe your viewpoint isn't yet complete. I'm not necessarily asking you to like invasions. I'm simply asking you to understand the mechanic a bit more deeply and have a little bit of respect for the red man that's in your world and understand what brought them to your world. I also want to talk about kind of the ubiquity of this mechanism, because I think this is a super important point in that every From multiplayer game has had invasions. Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and Bloodborne, all of these games have invasions. And that alone is a very telling point, because if invasions were really designed just to grief hosts, why on earth would a game developer include a feature like that? It doesn't make any sense. No game developer wants to create a feature that enables griefing, that's just there to irritate people. So I think if you think that's what invasions are for, you have to deal with why did the game developer choose to include them, and why have they included them so consistently? The other thing you have to think about is people always ask about the ability to disable invasions. And that feature has never been included. It's been one of the most frequently requested features, but along with the fact that these invasions have been part of every From multiplayer game, they've also never given you the ability to disable invasions, except and only to the extent that you can choose to play offline. You can choose to completely disable multiplayer, but then you don't get messages, you don't get co-op. It's a package deal. You get all the multiplayer, or you get none of it at all. And again, you need to come to terms with these facts if you think invasions are there again as some sort of griefing mechanism. Okay, so we know From has been very consistent in their use of this mechanic, this invasion mechanic. The question is why? Why did they put them in the game? And I think there's really two main reasons. The first of which, and I think this is the original reason, is designed to add tension to the game. It's designed to add tension to exploration. No matter where you are in the game, almost no matter where you are, there's always the threat of invasion. So if you're somebody like me, when you play one of these games, you choose to pick your way through quite slowly, carefully looking around each corner, you're never actually safe. This is a really important point, that the world is always hostile to you, even if only in a probabilistic sense, because even if you've cleared all the PvE out of a particular area and you're just standing there, you're actually not safe. You cannot pause the game. That is not a coincidence, because it's an always on multiplayer experience. So they wanted to create this tension aspect where you knew at any time your world could be invaded. And I've made this point before, but it's actually very similar to the tank mechanic in Left 4 Dead 2. The tank is a game-changing element, can come along at any time, it's unpredictable, and when the tank arrives, it's likely to change the outcome of the game. And very similar to that is the nature of invasions. The second reason for invasions, and I think this is a reason that's kind of evolved over time, it's designed to bring some balance to the game's difficulty. These games have long had co-op, but originally you couldn't summon people you knew. There was no way to coordinate with people, and so therefore there was no way to talk to somebody on a microphone. And as the game's co-op has improved and enabled you to work with more of your friends and people you know that you can talk to, it's created a corresponding decrease in the difficulty. Even one random phantom that you cannot coordinate with makes the game far easier. When you have 3 other phantoms, all of you are on a mic, it makes the game's difficulty quite trivial. So the only thing that brings balance is the invasion mechanic. And you can see this evolution, I believe, beginning around Bloodborne, because in Bloodborne, outside of 2 areas in the game, the 2 nightmare areas, you cannot be invaded in that game as a single player. It is the enablement of co-op, summoning another phantom, essentially turns on invasion. So you can see from tying these 2 concepts together, the concepts of co-op and invasion. In Dark Souls 3, you can get invaded by yourself, but it's much less probable. So as you bring phantoms into your world, each phantom that you add increases the probability of being invaded. So you can see from continuing this theme of more co-ops or more phantoms, more co-op means more probability of invasions. And of course, if you have enough phantoms and use the dried fingers, you can have 2, and in Covenant areas, even 3 invaders in your world at a time. Nearly everybody that plays Souls games, when they first play, they don't invade, they don't really engage the multiplayer except maybe to summon people for help with bosses or for getting through a particular level. But nearly everybody goes through the same evolution of attitude towards invasions. Nearly everybody I know, myself included, hates the invasion mechanic when they first start playing. It's a hallmark of every new player. Every new player expresses contempt for it, but usually what happens over time, if you play the games long enough, you begin to understand them better, you may begin to play more of the PvP yourself, and you start to understand and appreciate the invasion mechanic. Even if you don't invade, I get plenty of comments from people on my videos all the time. They don't invade, they're not always fans of the mechanic, but they really understand it, and they can recognize and appreciate it as a game element. And I think that's really important, and that's where I'm trying to take people with this video today. Not necessarily to get you to embrace the mechanic, but at least to understand and respect it as something more than just an engine for griefing new players. I think this is the part of the video where I really need people to listen with a clear and open mind. Try not to take offense. I'm certainly not out to offend anybody or insult anybody. But in order to talk about people's opposition to invasions and the reasons they offer, we have to first talk about something called self-deception. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, self-deception is the idea that as humans, we frequently lie to ourselves. We tell ourselves stories about the things we do, our motivations for doing these things, and we believe these lies. The brain is a pretty complicated engine, and self-deception is one of the chief things that we engage in. As humans, we're always in the pursuit of status. We want to avoid losing status. We're always looking to gain status. We look for our friends to gain status. We look for our enemies to lose status. Self-deception plays an important role here. In the simplest way that I can explain self-deception, I'll have some links to additional materials for those who want to learn more. But if you're familiar with Aesop's fables, the fables of the sour grapes. So one of the characters in the story wants these grapes, they desire the grapes, but they're unable to get them. And toward the end of the story, they abandon their search for the grapes and they say, well, the grapes were probably sour anyway. So essentially they're deceiving themselves. They're pretending as if they never wanted the grapes to begin with, when in fact they do want them, but they don't want to admit that they're unable to get something that they actually wanted. This aspect of self-deception, I think, is really important. It comes to why people claim that they don't like invasions. And I think if you keep this notion of self-deception in mind, as we start examining each of the reasons that people claim they don't like invasions, you'll realize they really don't stand up to scrutiny. They don't make any sense whatsoever. We'll look at this in some detail. Another example that I can give, this is actually something that used to happen with an ex-girlfriend of mine. I would say something like, hey, let's go to this restaurant and go eat. And my girlfriend would say, oh, I don't want to go to that restaurant because the lines there are just too long. And I would say, well, actually, I already called and there's no line there at all. And she would kind of huff. And what you could quickly conclude is that she did not want to go to the restaurant for reasons that had nothing to do with the line. The line was just a convenient excuse. So once I dispensed with that excuse that there was no line, she got irritated because essentially the lie that she was telling, maybe without even being aware of it, had been exposed and destroyed, which now confronted her with the decision of, hey, why don't I actually want to go to this restaurant? And it was a reason that maybe she didn't want to admit or she didn't want to talk about. And I'm sure we've all had these sorts of interactions in our social life, but this is kind of the nature of self-deception and what it looks like. And again, I just want to have you all keep in mind that the idea here is related to status and loss of status, and it goes to the core of any competitive endeavor, and especially here is relevant for invasions. Okay, so let's actually look at the reasons that people claim, the reasons people use when they claim they don't like invasions. And I just want to emphasize a few points. First, there's nothing wrong at all with disliking invasions. It's totally fine to dislike invasions. I have no issue with that at all. And I also want to emphasize that there are plenty of completely legitimate reasons to either dislike invasions or to find fault with invasions. For example, getting invaded at high wall by twinks that have way too many advantages. Incidentally, From has said that in the multiplayer, they're looking to make the invasion process, quote, more fair and less stressful for both sides. So let's hope that they continue to reduce the influence of twinks in the game. Latency management, new players have a tough time adjusting to latency, and if you get invaded by somebody that's really latent, that's a really miserable experience, and I can certainly understand disliking that. Glitches, glitch utilization, this is another completely legit reason in my view to dislike invasions. So it's fine to dislike invasions. There's plenty of reasons, legit reasons to dislike them. What we're going to talk about today are the reasons that I do not think are legitimate, the common excuses that people bring up for disdaining the mechanism, and I want to show why these just will never stand up to the light of day. Okay, so getting into the list proper. So now I'm going to kind of bucket some of these criticisms. So the first set of criticisms, you hear things like, I'm just here for the single player experience, or I just want the core experience of the game. I don't like PvP, or I even hear things like Sekiro proves that From games are fine without invasions. And that is to some extent true, but what people forget about Sekiro is it did not have invasions. That's true, but it also did not have co-op. And it proves that these From games work fine without co-op and invasions. It doesn't prove that they work without invasions. And what I tell people is, if you want the Sekiro experience in Dark Souls 3, or if you want it presumably in Elden Ring, it's very easy. Just play offline and you can have that exact same experience. And of course, the hidden complaint, what people aren't actually saying, what they really want, what they won't come out and say, is I want the game to be easy with co-op, but I don't want to have to deal with the threat of invasions. Of course, if people were forced to state it so explicitly, they would realize that that sounds kind of ridiculous, and they would also understand that from a game balancing perspective, that's simply not a viable approach. So if you don't want PvP, fine, shut off the online experience, but then you give up on co-op as well. The next complaint is something like, well, Reds just run away. Reds just run away. And if that were actually true, that would make the game remarkably easy and invasions remarkably easy to deal with. If Reds just run away, well then simply just play out the rest of the level as if they aren't there, because they effectively aren't, and then go to the boss when you're done. Of course, what they're really complaining about isn't that Reds just run away, it's Reds run away to avoid a blunder, or Reds run away to the PvE and they regroup and then they reinitiate. But of course, if players were forced to actually express that clearly, hey, these Reds just run away from my blender to heal up by the PvE and then come re-engage me, then it would sound like a pretty petty complaint, because in fact it is a very petty complaint. Of course, Reds are going to use the level, they're going to use the things that are at their disposal. They're at a lot of disadvantages. It's one of the few advantages they actually have, and it would be unreasonable to expect them not to use it. But this complaint is almost always framed as, quote, Reds just run away. That's not true. They don't just run away. They may run away periodically, but they return. And again, if Reds were to in fact just run away, then the game would be quite easy and you would just feel free to ignore them. So this is really not a very good complaint. The next one up is something along the lines of, they're just trying to ruin my game. This is absolutely false. Nobody is trying to ruin your game, with maybe some exceptions, twinks, things of that ilk, which I agree have no place in the game. But twinks are a very small part of the game. Twinks are really only an issue for roughly the first 5 to 7% of the game. Otherwise, twinking is a non-issue for the game. They're not trying to ruin your game. They're trying to engage in a competition. Just like it would make no sense if you and I sat down and played chess and you started beating me and I said, well, you're trying to ruin my game. No, you're not trying to ruin my game. You're engaging in competition. There's nothing wrong at all with competition. Nobody has the mindset, again, possibly with the exception of twinks in the early game, with, quote, trying to ruin your game. Okay, so next up, this one is actually probably my favorite, and this one I think is probably also the most revealing and the most interesting to talk about. This is the complaint that something like, I don't want to deal with invasions, they're an annoyance, they're an interruption, And you can kind of hear these key words. They're getting irritated by the invasion, but rather than stopping and asking themselves what is so irritating about invasions, they just take it as a given that of course they're irritating. And this is a classic case of self-deception and an unwillingness to really engage with what's troubling them. And I want to give you some evidence for this fact. First of all, why are invasions, quote, an interruption? Why do people privilege invasions in such a way? Nobody fights Midir 30 times and says, I hate Midir. Midir is such an interruption to my game. Even though chances are, if you're a new player and you've played the game 2 or 3 times, you've probably died to any one boss way more times than you've died to any invader. So if you're simply looking at something that's, quote, wasting your time or is an interruption, then almost certainly any one of these harder bosses is going to be more of an interruption than any PvP player. But the fact that people treat this framing as obvious, that an invader is an interruption, whereas a boss or the PvE is not an interruption, sort of forces you to ask, well, what do you consider an interruption? Why do you consider it an interruption? And these are the questions that people aren't really asking themselves. The other thing that's interesting about this is people will complain and say, well, they jump off a cliff or they kill themselves because invasions are annoying and they're an interruption. But note something very interesting. If you invade somebody and they've got 2 phantoms, why don't they just kill themselves? If invasions were truly the interruption that people say they are, you would expect that the moment they get invaded, they would jump off a cliff so they could get the experience over with as quickly as possible. But that's not what happens. They'll fight you. It's only once their phantoms are dead that they will then kill themselves or disconnect, which really shows that this is not about an interruption or anything like that. It's about not wanting to lose to other human players. And I addressed this in my video on disconnecting, so I won't go into it in too much more detail, but at root, this is what annoys people about invasions. They do not want to be put in a situation where they're engaged in competitive play against somebody else that is almost certainly better than they are at the game. So next up is the idea that people don't like being invaded because they don't want to be, quote, griefed. I don't like Reds because they're griefers. Well, the funny thing here is if these people were to spend any amount of time invading whatsoever, they would quickly realize that if you want to grief people, invading is actually the wrong way to go about it. If you want to grief people, the way to go about it is to get a really strong gank squad together and camp somewhere and wait for invaders to come to you and grief the invaders. That's the easy way in this game to grief. Invading is a very difficult way to grief people. You might get some occasional opportunities, but not very many. Again, accepting twinks in the very early part of the game, they unfairly outmatch the host. You'll get no argument from me about that. I do agree, but that's again a very small slice of the game where that's actually possible. That wouldn't explain general opposition to the invasion mechanic. The other interesting thing is, why don't these players get upset about the scripted NPC invasions? If the invasion experience were so annoying, they would be complaining about the fact that From actually has built-in NPC invasions. And this is also another telling point about the mechanic. From thinks the invasion mechanic is so important that even if you play offline, you are still going to get invaded by NPC invaders. But nobody ever complains about those. Well, why not? Why don't they complain about it? It's essentially the same thing, right? The only difference, there's not another human being on the other side that's causing you a loss of status to cause you to experience that sense of loss in a competition. And that again is what's really driving people's opposition to invasions. If it were about interruptions and all these other things, then they would feel just as strongly about being invaded by NPCs. The next point I want to address, and I talked about this a little bit tangentially really in my disconnecting video, and I didn't make the point as clearly as I wanted, and I kind of regret that. It was one of the regrets I had about that video, so I want to try to fix that here. People say, well, it's called an invasion. You're invading me, as if the word invasion itself indicates that you're doing something wrong, that the person has a legitimate complaint because it's called an invasion. And the point that I was trying to make is, I don't actually invade you. There is no real invasion mechanic in Dark Souls 3. There's just this asymmetric multiplayer that from a lore perspective is called an invasion, but it's absolutely by consent. You're playing a multiplayer online game, and one of the keys to this multiplayer online game is if you're embered, if you play in certain areas where the boss is alive, you open yourself up to multiplayer. That's just how the game works. It's just one of the rules of it. So getting upset with other people that are just playing the game by the rules doesn't really make any sense. And it's certainly not an invasion in the sense of like a home invasion where you have a reasonable expectation that nobody's going to come in your house without invitation. You have invited us into your game by playing a game that operates by these rules. Anyway, I wish I had made this point a bit more clearly before, and I regret that I didn't, so trying to fix that here. The last thing I want to point out here is when you see complaints about people who are complaining about invasions, you'll typically hear them make very derisive remarks about sweaty players and try-hard players, and I don't want to fight somebody that's got thousands of hours in the game and they have no life and they live in their mom's basement, and just all these insults about people who invade. And again, this is telling you what the objection really is. Like, what does the fact that somebody lives in their mom's basement have to do with whether it's an interruption or not, or whether invasions are good for the game or anything like that? It doesn't. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's an attempt to insult the person that's causing them the loss of status. Again, this is the objection. People don't like a competitive game where the person on the other end is enjoying your loss of status and they gain status through victory in a video game. That's really what people are on about. And that's why they point out that the other person has so much more experience and is so much better at the game than they are, because that's what's really frustrating them, because they're engaged in a competition with somebody that they know is better, somebody that's likely to beat them at a video game and cause them to get frustrated. So if you look at what people are actually saying, you can suss out what their actual core objection to the invasion mechanic is. So I'll leave you guys with just a couple thoughts. Rizio left a comment on one of my videos. I think it was the disconnecting one. It was really a brilliant comment. I'll see if I can reproduce it here for the video. But in it, he essentially points out that the invasion mechanic, one of the keys that you can tell that it's very much an intended, integral part of the game, is that in each of the From multiplayer games, the tools you need to invade are given to you very, very early in the game. And it's essentially a message that, hey, this is a regular part of the game. You're invited to participate. It's a way to try to incentivize new players to give invasions a try. Again, just very clear messaging from the developers that they consider this to be a very core part of the game. So I thought, anyway, it was a really insightful comment from Rizio. I'll try to include it here below or maybe in a pinned comment so everybody here can see it as well. Guys, I hope you guys all got something out of this video. Really, if you're new to the game, invasions may be a little frustrating when you first start off, but please understand they're responsible for so much longevity of the game. The multiplayer is what really keeps people playing these games year in, year out. If you pick up a From game 3 years after launch and you see plenty of white signs on the ground for you to summon to beat a boss, understand that the primary reason they're there is tied to the multiplayer. If this game didn't have multiplayer, a lot of the interest would wane. Newer players would have a much harder time getting involved and interested in the game because there wouldn't be the community support around them. There wouldn't be the fandoms to come and help you beat the bosses. So you have to see this as all part of one big ecosystem. Invasions are a part of it, but they're still a really important part. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.